Most people think they know what the Gulag was. They picture a frozen wasteland somewhere past the Ural Mountains, a place where secret police in long coats dragged people from their beds in the middle of the night for saying the wrong thing at the wrong dinner party. They picture Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a lone survivor, writing it all down so the world would never forget. It's a clean story with a clear villain, the paranoid dictator crushing dissent, and a clear purpose, terror for terror's sake. But here's the problem. That story, while not false, is dangerously incomplete. The Gulag was not simply a machine for punishing enemies of the state. Let me say that again because it matters. Punishment was the excuse. What the Gulag actually was, at its core, is far stranger, far more calculated, and in some ways far more disturbing than the version most people have been taught. It was an economic institution, a colonization project, a system so deliberately engineered around production quotas, labor output, and resource extraction that historians who have spent decades combing through the Soviet archives now argue the terror and the economics were never separate things at all. They were the same machine, running on the same fuel. And the most unsettling part is that understanding this design tells us something uncomfortable about how modern states can turn human beings into raw material without ever using the word slavery. So let's go back, not to the show trials of the 1930s, but much further, because the true origin of the Gulag doesn't start with Stalin. It starts with Lenin in the chaos of a civil war in a monastery on a frozen island in the White Sea. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they inherited a country that was already collapsing. Civil war tore through Russia for years afterward, and Lenin's government, desperate to eliminate opposition and desperate for labor to rebuild a shattered economy, issued a decree in April of 1919 establishing forced labor camps. This is the detail that most popular history skips entirely. The camp system did not begin with Stalin's paranoia in the 1930s. It began more than a decade earlier, under Lenin, as an explicitly dual-purpose institution. It was meant to isolate political enemies, yes, but it was also meant, from the very first documents, to put idle hands to work rebuilding roads, clearing forests, and mining resources the new Soviet state desperately needed. One of the earliest and most infamous camps on the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea was established inside a former monastery, and it became something like a laboratory. Guards and administrators there experimented with labor quotas, ration systems tied to output, and punishment regimes that would later be scaled up across the entire Soviet Union. Prisoners who met their quota ate, prisoners who didn't. The single mechanism, the linking of food to output, is the seed from which the entire later system grew. Now here's the critical thing that most conventional accounts gloss over when they discuss the Gulag. Through the 1920s, the camp system remained relatively small, a few tens of thousands of prisoners scattered across a handful of camps. It was Stalin's rise to total power at the end of the decade, combined with a specific economic crisis that transformed a marginal penal institution into an empire. In 1929, Stalin launched forced collectivization of agriculture and the first five-year plan, an all-out push to industrialize the Soviet Union in a single decade. Both policies required enormous quantities of labor in places no free worker wanted to go. Siberia, the Arctic Circle, the Kolyma River Basin, so remote and so brutal that even hardened settlers avoided it. Collectivization also produced millions of new enemies of the state almost overnight. Wealthier peasants labeled kulaks, resistors, anyone who objected to having their land and livestock seized. The state suddenly had two problems that fit together with horrifying convenience. It had millions of people it wanted to remove from society, and it had a desperate need for cheap, coerced labor in locations too harsh and too remote for ordinary wages to attract workers. The Gulag, formally established as a centralized administration in 1930 under the secret police, was the solution to both problems at once. This is where a man named Naftali Frenkel enters the story. And if there is one person who might be considered the true architect of the Gulag's internal design, it is him. Frenkel was not a career secret policeman. He was, by most accounts, a businessman, a former timber trader, who had himself been arrested and sent to the Solovetsky camp as a prisoner. And it was Frenkel, according to multiple historical accounts, including survivor testimony collected by Solzhenitsyn himself, who proposed the innovation that would define the Gulag for the next quarter century. Stop feeding prisoners a flat ration regardless of what they produced. Instead, tie the size of every meal directly to the percentage of a work quota completed. Prisoners who exceeded their quota received extra bread. Prisoners who fell short received less. In the harsh climates where most camps were located, falling behind on rations while performing brutal physical labor created a downward spiral that was almost impossible to escape. It was, in effect, a machine for converting human bodies into productivity, and then discarding the ones that stopped producing. Frenkel rose through the ranks of the camp administration and eventually oversaw major infrastructure projects built entirely with prisoner labor. This detail matters enormously because it reveals something the popular narrative almost never captures. The system's cruelty was not incidental to its purpose. It was engineered directly into its economic logic. The clearest proof of this design is the White Sea-Baltic Canal, known as the Belomor Canal, built between 1931 and 1933. Stalin wanted a shipping canal connecting the White Sea to the Baltic, and he wanted it built fast, cheap, and without the heavy machinery that a Western nation would have used. So he used prisoners, roughly 250,000 of them, working with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows in subarctic conditions, often without adequate tools, food, or shelter. The canal was completed in a little over a year, celebrated by Soviet propaganda as a triumph of socialist labor, and the regime even brought a group of famous Soviet writers on a guided tour to produce a glowing book about the project. What that propaganda book didn't mention was the death toll. Estimates vary wildly, from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, precisely because the Soviet state had no interest in counting corpses that stood in the way of a good headline. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Once completed, the canal turned out to be too shallow for most large vessels to use. An entire population was worked to death, in significant numbers, to build an infrastructure project whose actual economic output never justified its human cost. This pattern, spectacular in its ambition and catastrophic in its execution, repeats itself again and again across the Gulag's history. The Kolyma gold fields, the Vorkuta coal mines, the Trans-Siberian railway extensions. The camps weren't randomly located. They were placed with cold precision on top of the exact resources the Soviet industrial machine needed most: timber, coal, gold, nickel, uranium later on, in regions where no rational free labor market would ever have supplied workers voluntarily. Now let's talk about scale, because the numbers involved are almost impossible to hold in your head. Historians estimate that somewhere between 18 and 20 million people passed through the Gulag system between the late 1920s and the mid-1950s. That number alone should reframe how you think about this institution. This wasn't a prison for a few thousand dissidents. It was a parallel economy, a shadow labor force roughly comparable in size to the population of a mid-sized European nation, cycling continuously through camps, colonies, and transit prisons across 11 time zones. Estimates of the total number of deaths inside the system range from roughly 1.5 million on the more conservative end, based on surviving Soviet administrative records, to considerably higher figures, when historians account for the chronic underreporting built into those very same records. Camp administrators had every incentive to release dying prisoners just before death, so their deaths wouldn't count against the camp's official mortality statistics, a practice researchers have specifically documented, and which means even the archival numbers likely understate the true toll. On top of the camps themselves, the Great Terror of 1937 and 1938 added a further layer of horror entirely outside the labor system. Under a directive known as Order 04047, secret police were given actual numerical quotas. Not evidence, not individual suspicion. Quotas for how many people in each region needed to be arrested and how many needed to be executed. Regional officials competed with each other, asking Moscow for permission to exceed their assigned targets. More than 500,000 people were shot during this 2-year period alone, often after trials that lasted minutes. Here is where the story gets deeply strange, and where most conventional histories of the Gulag miss the mark entirely. For decades, Western historians argued fiercely about what the Gulag actually was. One camp of historians, often called the totalitarian school, argued during the Cold War that the camps were purely an instrument of ideological terror, a tool for total political control with economics as an afterthought. A rival group of historians working in the 1970s and 80s, and often called revisionists, pushed back hard, arguing that Soviet society under Stalin involved genuine popular participation, and that the horror stories from defectors and memoirists like Solzhenitsyn were exaggerated for Cold War propaganda purposes. Neither side, it turns out, had access to the actual Soviet archives. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and those archives opened, a new generation of historians, most prominently the Russian historian Oleg Klevniuk and the American journalist and historian Anne Applebaum, went in and read the internal memos, the production reports, the secret police correspondence that neither the totalitarian school nor the revisionists had ever seen. And what they found didn't fully vindicate either side. It showed something more unsettling than both. The archives revealed a system in which the terror and the economics were completely intertwined, where the same bureaucrats who signed execution orders also filed detailed quarterly reports on timber output and gold extraction quotas, where political purges of camp administrators happened in the same breath as arguments about whether prisoner rations should be cut to save money. Klevniuk's research in particular shows that political paranoia and economic exploitation weren't competing explanations for the Gulag. They were two faces of a single Stalinist logic, in which human beings existed to be sorted, extracted from, and discarded in whatever combination best served the state at that moment. And here's a twist that almost never makes it into popular retellings, because it complicates the simple narrative that the Gulag was, at minimum, a brutally efficient economic machine, even if a morally monstrous one. It wasn't efficient. This is the finding that has genuinely surprised later generations of researchers going through the archives. In 1935, the head of the secret police wrote directly to Stalin promising that every kilometer of road built with prisoner labor would come in tens of thousands of rubles cheaper than free labor. That promise became something like an article of faith inside the Soviet bureaucracy for the next 2 decades. But when historians actually reconstructed the internal accounting of the camp system after the archives opened, the picture that emerged was strikingly different. Coerced labor, it turns out, is not actually cheap. Prisoners worked without incentive, without skill, often literally starving, in remote locations that required the state to build entire supporting infrastructures, guard forces, transit systems, and administrative bureaucracies just to keep the machine running. Historians studying the internal ledgers found the system's true costs, the guards, the transportation, the constant churn of dying and replacement workers, were almost never factored into the productivity claims that Soviet officials proudly reported upward. The consensus among the archive-era historians is that the Gulag was, in cold economic terms, a persistent drain on Soviet resources rather than the engine of industrialization its architects claimed it to be, which means the entire justification the state used to defend the system to itself, that this suffering was the necessary price of building socialism, was built on numbers that were, in a very real sense, fiction. Now, let's talk about what daily life inside this machine actually looked like, because the human cost behind these statistics is where the story becomes something you feel rather than something you calculate. Prisoners were sorted from the moment of arrival, political prisoners, common criminals, and a brutal internal hierarchy among career criminals who often preyed on political prisoners with something close to the guards' tacit approval. Housing was primitive, often unheated barracks, in regions where winter temperatures fell to -40 and below. The workday could stretch to 12 or 14 hours, 6 days a week, in mines, forests, and construction sites, using tools that would have looked primitive even by 19th century standards. Malnutrition was endemic. Scurvy, dysentery, tuberculosis, and frostbite killed far more prisoners than execution ever did. Women faced their own particular horrors, sexual violence from guards and fellow prisoners that camp authorities routinely ignored. Children were not spared either. Family members of people labeled enemies of the state, including elderly parents and young children, were frequently swept into the system simply for being related to someone the regime had targeted. And perhaps the cruelest detail of all is how deliberately this suffering was hidden in plain sight. Soviet citizens outside the camps generally knew the Gulag existed. They knew people who had simply vanished. But the sheer scale, the true death toll, the mechanics of the ration system, all of it remained a state secret enforced through a culture of fear so total that even discussing it in a private letter could get you sent to the very system you were describing. Nowhere does this design reveal itself more starkly than in Kolyma, the region prisoners themselves came to call the planet of the dead. Located in the far northeastern corner of Siberia, reachable only by sea through the port of Magadan for most of the year, Kolyma held some of the richest gold deposits on Earth. And the Soviet state built an entire administrative empire, known internally as Dalstroy, specifically to extract that gold using prisoner labor. The climate alone made Kolyma a weapon. Winter temperatures routinely fell far below anything a human body can endure through prolonged outdoor labor, and yet mining quotas did not adjust for weather. Prisoners worked regardless, digging into permafrost with hand tools, and camp administrators measured success purely in kilograms of gold delivered to Moscow. Survivors who wrote about Kolyma afterward described a place where the ordinary rules of human society seemed to have been suspended entirely, where the distance between life and death was measured in grams of bread, and where a broken tool or an injured hand could be the difference between meeting quota and starving. The gold that came out of Kolyma helped fund Soviet industrialization, and later, the war effort against Nazi Germany. The bodies that stayed behind, buried in permafrost, too solid to properly dig graves in, were rarely counted with any precision at all. This is the trade the Soviet state made again and again across its resource frontier, trading human lives for tonnage and treating the exchange rate as a state secret. Inside the camps themselves, prisoners developed their own brutal social order that the guards often tolerated because it served the system's purposes. Career criminals, referred to in camp slang as the thieves, frequently formed their own hierarchy with its own code of conduct. And camp administrators regularly used these criminal networks to help control and intimidate political prisoners, effectively outsourcing a portion of camp discipline to the prisoners themselves. Political prisoners, who often included teachers, engineers, priests, army officers, and ordinary citizens, denounced by a neighbor or a jealous colleague, frequently found themselves at the bottom of this internal hierarchy. stripped of the few possessions they had managed to keep and subjected to violence the guards were content to ignore. Informants were everywhere, sometimes other prisoners recruited under threat or promise of better rations, which meant that trust itself became one of the scarcest resources inside the wire. Yet even within this system, historians have documented remarkable instances of solidarity, prisoners who shared their last piece of bread with someone weaker, doctors and nurses among the prisoner population who risked punishment to falsify medical exemptions and spare fellow inmates from the harshest labor assignments. These small acts of resistance rarely changed outcomes at scale, but they are a critical part of the historical record, because they remind us that the system's dehumanization was never total, no matter how completely its architects intended it to be. Let me bring all of these threads together now, because the true horror of the Gulag is not any single cause or any single villain. It's the way ideology, economics, bureaucratic incentive, and human cruelty reinforced each other in a machine that no single reform could fix, because the machine was working exactly as designed. You had a founding logic, inherited from Lenin, that treated forced labor as a legitimate tool of state power from the very beginning, not an aberration invented later by Stalin. You had Frankel's ration system, which converted human survival itself into a productivity lever, embedding brutality into the mathematics of the institution rather than leaving it to the whims of individual guards. You had a state desperate to industrialize an enormous resource-rich but nearly uninhabited territory, and a political system that had just manufactured millions of new enemies through collectivization, providing both the motive and the population to solve that labor problem through coercion rather than wages. You had a culture of quota-driven terror, epitomized by Order 00447, in which the machinery of arrest and execution operated on numerical targets handed down from the center, completely detached from individual guilt or innocence. And you had an economic myth, the claim that all of this suffering was justified by efficiency, that turned out under archival scrutiny to be largely false, meaning the system persisted for over 2 decades, not because it worked, but because dismantling it would have meant admitting the entire premise was a lie. What historians get wrong, time and again when they reduce this to a simple morality tale, is treating the Gulag as though it were fundamentally a story about one evil man's paranoia. That framing is not just incomplete. It's dangerously reassuring because it implies the horror ended when the paranoid man died. Stalin did die in 1953, and the camp population did begin shrinking almost immediately afterward under an amnesty pushed through by Lavrentiy Beria, followed by a much broader wave of releases and rehabilitations after Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes in 1956. But the deeper machinery that made the Gulag possible, a state willing to define entire categories of human beings as economic and political raw material, a bureaucracy that measured its own success in tons of extracted ore and kilometers of completed canal rather than in human lives preserved, that machinery didn't require Stalin specifically. It required only a system willing to look away from the cost, as long as the numbers on the report looked good. And if that sounds uncomfortably familiar, in any context involving forced or coerced labor anywhere in the world today, it should. Systems of unfree labor tied to state or corporate quotas have not vanished from the earth. They've simply adapted to new justifications and new bureaucratic language. There's one more dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and that is what happened to the truth itself after the camps closed. For decades, the full scale of the Gulag remained obscured, partly by Soviet secrecy and partly because, even after Khrushchev's partial acknowledgement, the state never conducted anything resembling a full public reckoning. It was Solzhenitsyn's smuggled manuscript published abroad in 1973 that first forced global public attention onto the scale of what had happened, built from years of secretly gathered survivor testimony at enormous personal risk. But even his account, monumental as it was, could only capture a fraction of the picture because he was writing without access to the internal state archives that later historians would eventually uncover. Today, in Russia, the memory of the Gulag remains a genuinely contested and politically sensitive subject, with public commemoration efforts existing alongside official narratives that increasingly minimize or reframe this period of history. The lesson embedded in that ongoing struggle over memory is perhaps the most important one of all. Historical atrocities do not stay understood once they are exposed. They can be forgotten, softened, or rewritten within a single generation if no one insists on remembering them accurately. The Gulag was not a single event with a single cause, and it was not simply the product of one man's cruelty. It was a systemic institution built on an economic theory that turned out to be false, sustained by a bureaucracy that had every incentive to keep the lie alive, and enforced through a machinery of quotas and rations that made ordinary administrators, not just secret police fanatics, complicit in mass death. And the most dangerous myth of all is the comforting one, the idea that a system this brutal could only ever be built by an obviously monstrous regime, easily recognized and safely confined to the history books. If this story changed the way you think about how forced labor systems actually get built and sustained, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the institutions and decisions that quietly shaped the 20th century. The kind of history that rarely makes it into a textbook chapter, but explains far more about how power actually works than the headline events do. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on what you think was the most important piece of the Gulag's design, the economic incentive structure, the quota-driven terror, or the myth of efficiency that kept it running. I'd genuinely like to hear your take. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about understanding how these systems of power and control actually functioned. I'll see you in the next one.